Any way to run a presidential campaign, and who's to blame for this sort of thing?
I don't like it, Mike. I wish we didn't have to do it. Remember, George Bush has been attacking me almost on a daily basis since May. And I learned from painful experience back in 1978 when I faced the same kind of campaign in my first race for re-election for governor of Massachusetts. And when I refused to respond, that if you let these attacks go unanswered, you're going to get beat. I mean, I'm looking at a spot today, and you are, suggesting that I've polluted or am responsible for Boston Harbor. I'm the first governor in the history of my state to clean it up. No thanks to Mr. Bush, who tried to kill the Clean Water Act twice and kill the federal grant program. And in fact, Boston Harbor is now being cleaned up. Well, what do you do under these circumstances? Unfortunately, you have to respond. I wish I didn't. I'd much rather talk about the importance of change and why we've got to control our economic future and get on with building an America that can compete in this increasingly competitive world of ours, and what we're going to do to invest in jobs and schools, and do something about drugs and our kids and college opportunity. But the reality is that if somebody comes at you like that, you do have to respond, and I'm sorry that's the case, but I learned it at firsthand in a very painful way.
But we're being told there were those in the Democratic Party in particular who wonder why you took so long to fire back. If you knew that, if you knew, and having had your experience when you ran for governor at that time and were defeated, why did you wait so long to fire back?
Well, because I don't like this kind of campaigning, frankly, and I'm reluctant to do it. And at first I tried very hard to avoid it. But it was obvious that it was taking its toll. I mean, if that's all people see, I mean, here we have an attack on a furlough program. George Bush knows that the federal government, his administration, has had one of the most wide-open furlough programs in the country. They're furloughing thousands of drug pushers, the very people he says he now wants to execute. President Reagan, when he was governor, had a very extensive furlough program, which also ended in tragedy. And as a matter of fact, a police officer and a school teacher were murdered by people who had been furloughed. Nobody ever accused Ronald Reagan of being soft on crime any more than I'm soft on crime. And I think it's a very cynical use of what was a human tragedy. But if, in fact, that's the kind of thing that the Bush campaign and Mr. Bush are going to do, then you have to come back to it, and you have to go on the attack. I tried hard not to do it. After a while, it was obvious that we just had to.
But it's easy for you to say you're reacting to George Bush. I mean, what you're really telling us is that if he's wrong, you're going to be wrong too. The two wrongs, in a sense, make a right. You can both stop it. Or what can you do? What if you stop it unilaterally?
What I'm saying, regrettably, is that having been the subject of this kind of campaign at the state level, not once but twice, I've come to the reluctant conclusion that you simply can't sit there and continue to take these attacks, because sooner or later people will believe them. At the same time, however, I'm doing my very best, as you know, to address the fundamental issues and the real concerns of average Americans across the country. So that's why I'm dealing with the issue of economic growth and the creation of good jobs, and how we're going to improve the quality of our schools and make it possible for young people to go to college. Today, for example, I talked about what I and Senator Benson hope we can do to make home ownership a possibility for young families in this country. Let them use their IRAs as down payments. So I'm going to try to continue to do that, but I also am going to have to respond to what, in many cases, are distorted attacks on my record, which have to be responded to.
And we have to be careful not to let you make a speech here, right? Carry on with the pressing questions.
Right.
I was going to follow yours with a question about international affairs having to do with you and Bush quarreling with each other so much. You know, there are all kinds of reports from Washington, the Middle East, everywhere, that Ronald Reagan and George Bush are planning an October surprise, perhaps. You know, there are reports that American arms are being sent to Iran again, this time through South Korea. Are you hearing about these reports? Are you concerned that there may be an attempt on the international scene to put something together to lock this election up between now and November?
Well, I would hope not. I would hope not. I can't think of anything worse than that happening. I hope certainly that we can get those hostages back. They and their families have gone through as painful an experience as any family could possibly go through. But
could it be,
if there's one principle, Walter, which we have to be committed to, and which, as you know, was violated so badly and so tragically in the Iran-Contra scandal, it is that you can never make concessions to terrorists. You can never give something in order to get those hostages back. You have a responsibility to try to work to get them back. But the tragedy of the Iran-Contra scandal was that we, in fact, traded arms for hostages, thereby encouraging other terrorists to take more hostages. And we can never do that again. I think that's a lesson. I certainly hope it's a lesson that the administration has learned. And remember, too, that Secretary Shultz and Secretary Weinberger both argued very strongly against that deal, and yet it did go through, and Mr. Bush supported it.
Governor, you've been doing a lot of talking about Dan Quayle. Almost hourly, your campaign is talking about Dan Quayle. If you were George Bush right now, would you drop him from the ticket?
Well, that's a judgment only Mr. Bush can make, but what I think it tells the American people, Larry, is something pretty important about the way Mike Dukakis makes presidential decisions and the way George Bush makes them. The selection of a running mate was the first important presidential decision that we were called upon to make, even before we were elected. It's in a very real sense our first national security decision, because the Vice President will be on the National Security Council, will be a member of the Cabinet, and could at some point, if something happened to the President, become the Commander-in-Chief of the United States. There's been a lot of discussion in this campaign about national security. I picked Lloyd Bentsen. Strong, mature, a leader, thoughtful. I think everybody saw that the other night, and people who have worked with him know that. George Bush picked Dan Quayle. I think that says a lot about how I make decisions, the kind of people I'm looking for in an administration, and how Mr. Bush would. And it goes to the question of judgment as to what kind of a president you're going to be and what kind of people you're going to surround yourself with.
What would your strategy be if he suddenly decided to withdraw from the race, Dan Quayle?
I'd continue to run, I hope, as positive a campaign on the issues of concern, Walter, to mainstream America. And it would have to be up to Mr. Bush to make that decision and decide who he replaced him with if he was going to replace him.
Governor Dukakis, one of the purposes that Senator Quayle has attempted to serve for the Republicans, and indeed a centerpiece of their strategy, has been to paint you as a liberal, a category into which relatively few Americans now place themselves. Does that label fit? And if so, or if not, what label does fit?
Jim, the Republicans have been doing this for as long as I can remember. They tried to do it to FDR, and they called him a lot of names, including liberal. They did it to Harry Truman. They tried to do it to John Kennedy. I've been a chief executive for 10 years now. I've balanced 10 budgets in a row. I've cut taxes 5 times in the past 6 years. I signed one of the toughest child pornography laws in the country. We've put 5 times as many drug pushers in jail under my administration as we had in the previous administration. But I'm also the governor of a state that's helped over 50,000 welfare families to move from welfare to work with training for those welfare mothers and daycare for their children. I'm the governor this past spring who signed the first universal health care bill in the country, which will guarantee basic health insurance to all of my citizens. How do you label that? That's Mike Dukakas. Those are my values.
Well,
I picked Lloyd Bentsen. I picked Lloyd Bentsen to be my running mate for vice president. Not because I wanted a clone of Mike Dukakas. I wanted somebody who was strong, who was effective, who was experienced. And this use of labels and slogans and symbols is, again, I think, a characteristic of the way Mr. Bush is running his campaign. You know, back in 1964, he used another label. He called Medicare socialized medicine. I wonder if he still believes that these days.
Well, but you mentioned JFK and FDR, and I don't think too many people would argue that they could indeed be categorized in many areas as liberals. How did this term develop such a pejorative connotation for so many voters?
Well, I think in the minds of some voters, the term liberal means that you're kind of permissive and you don't have values and you don't have standards. I mean, anybody who knows Mike Dukakis knows that I have a strong sense of values and very strong standards. And I also know that one of the things that conservatives are supposed to do is to pay their bills, to balance budgets. George Bush has never balanced a budget in his life. And I thought it was interesting at the debate the other day when Senator Bentsen said that if any one of us was given $200 billion worth of hot checks, we could create an illusion of prosperity as well. So these labels really are very meaningless, and I understand what the Republicans are trying to do tactically here. I just hope that in the course of the next month, as we finish up this campaign, my values, my standards, my commitment to those basic issues and concerns of mainstream Americans will come through, and if that happens, then we're going to win this election.
Governor, I'd like to take you back to a little bit earlier in the campaign, if I may. The New York primary. You became aware, and obviously it was a headline-making issue, race relations, the strain.
Right.
that exists between blacks and whites. And not only in this city, I think all of us would agree on this panel here that all of our cities have, to a certain extent, some problems with race relations. Right. Do you acknowledge it as a national problem? And what are you prepared, as president, to do about it?
It's certainly a national problem, Mike. Always has been. Maybe as long as people are around, there will be some people who look down at others because of their background or ethnicity or their color. I think one of the most important responsibilities of a political leader, whether a governor or a president, is to provide the kind of leadership which brings people together, which creates understanding among people, and which does those things that open up the door of opportunity to all of our citizens, and as I said in Atlanta at the convention, make every American a full shareholder in the American dream, regardless of who they are or where they come from or what the color of their skin. I've tried very hard to do that as the governor of my state, and I think we've made real progress, although my state is not immune from these kinds of difficulties, and I guess that's true of any state. As President of the United States, I would bring to the White House a very strong commitment to equality of opportunity, to a civil rights commission with people on it who believe in the law, to strong affirmative action, to the kind of thing which will make all of our citizens part of what this country is all about. You will see a cabinet and administration that is diverse, that has good people of all races and backgrounds and communities, and you will also see somebody appointing judges who reflect that diversity and are top-notch judges, as I have as governor of my state.
As long as you bring up the question of judges, what kind of litmus test, if any, would you have for judicial appointments?
I don't have a litmus test, Mike, and here again, the American people have a record to judge on. George Bush has never appointed a judge in his life. I've appointed over 130, because in my state, the governor has the same authority that the president has. I appoint all of the judges, and I appoint them for life. And I have a reputation for picking good judges. Why? Because I don't apply litmus tests. I don't even know what party registration they are, and I don't care. I'm looking for people of intelligence, of integrity, of judicial temperament, because when you appoint a judge as President of the United States, that's an appointment for life. Long after you leave the White House, that person's going to be there. And I've always looked for good, strong, able people, and they are out there in abundance. So there's no excuse for a president not picking the very best, and I would do that.
Good, strong, able people like Reverend Jesse Jackson, for one. The man you described as the best in America seems somehow, Mr. Dukakis, to have disappeared from the Dukakis campaign.
Walter, on the contrary, he's out there campaigning.
He's registering voters, I know that.
We're in touch on a regular basis as well.
But why are you two not doing more together? It seems clear to those who are watching voting trends right now that the minority groups, which must be your strength, particularly blacks, are sitting back. They don't seem to be as involved. I know in Chicago, for example, Jesse Jackson's people are telling us every day that there is not the passion in the inner city. Excuse that word, passion. There's not the passion in the inner city for you that there ought to be, which you may be able to generate if you were there with Jesse Jackson.
Well, Jesse and I have campaigned a number of times together, Walter. We marched in Washington together. We were in New York here at a major fundraiser together. We were in Dallas at the Baptist Convention together. We'll be together at other events as well. But he's out there every day working hard, actively involved. We talk on a regular basis and exchange ideas, and you'll see that passion, you'll see that commitment. Remember, this is just beginning to be an election that people are focusing in on now in the last few weeks, and there are still enormous numbers of people out there who aren't yet that deeply involved, haven't made up their minds and so on, but we're working very hard. I think
he's not a danger to you. You don't feel that Jesse Jackson may turn off more people than he turns on?
I'm somebody who believes in bringing people together. That's the kind of president I want to be. That's the kind of governor I've been. Everybody has got to be a part of this. We've had too much divisiveness, too much polarization in this country over the past few years, and I want to be a president who unites America, and that means bringing good people of all races, backgrounds, concerns together.
Governor, ever since 1968, when the gun lobby began its work, no gun control candidate has ever been elected to federal office in Pennsylvania. 60% of all the homes in Pennsylvania apparently have weapons, according to the latest figures. As you may or may not know, the gun lobby in Pennsylvania is working very actively against you.
As they have, by the way, in my own state.
They say that you're against gun owners. How do you respond to that accusation?
Well, they're doing what I'm afraid the Bush campaign has been doing, and that is to badly distort my record. I've never had a problem with the idea that hunters and sportsmen ought to have weapons and use them for legitimate sport purposes, nor the ability of people to defend themselves in their homes, subject to state law, obviously. But this has become a law enforcement issue now, Larry, as I think you know. Police chiefs and law enforcement officers all over the country are asking for some protection against cop-killer bullets, against plastic guns that can go right through a metal detector and threaten the lives and safety of literally millions of American and world citizens who are passengers. And they're also asking for a 7-day waiting period before convicted felons and people with long histories of mental illness can get a gun. And as you know, although the Congress turned it down, there was a very substantial vote for it. Now, this is a law enforcement issue. Sportsmen have a perfect right to have their guns and use them. I'm concerned about kids with AK-47s and Uzis who are driving around cities in this country and killing people. And that's what the police are concerned about. That's what the police chiefs are concerned about. That's what the cop on the beat is concerned about. And I think the Brady Amendment, which, as you know, has been led by Sarah Brady, whose husband took that bullet that was intended for the president, shot by a young man who had had a long history of mental illness. That's what the Brady Amendment is all about. I think the vast majority of American citizens and Pennsylvania citizens support the Brady Amendment, support a ban on cop-killer bullets and on plastic weapons.
Why is there the perception, though, then, if that's what you say, that you're against owners, legal owners of weapons?
Because the National Rifle Association has been violently opposed to each of those three very legitimate protections for citizens and for law enforcement officers. And as you know, their lobbying effort was unfortunately successful in defeating the Brady Amendment. The real question is, what's the Vice President's position on these issues? Is he against a ban on cop-killer bullets? Is he for permitting plastic weapons to go through metal detectors and threaten people on planes? Doesn't he think, as I think the President of the United States believes, that a 7-day waiting period so we can at least check out the person who's trying to buy the gun to make sure they weren't convicted of a felony or don't have a long history of mental instability, doesn't he think that that's, at the very least, the kind of protection we ought to provide our police officers and our citizens? That's a question which I hope maybe you'll put to him, or maybe I'll put to him. But there's no question that the NRA is opposed to anybody who adopts the kinds of positions I have. And again, it isn't because I'm opposed to sportsmen and hunters having weapons. I'm not and never have been.
Governor, you align yourself there with law enforcement officers, but the Republicans seem to have been able to convince a large segment of the public that they are tougher on crime because they advocate harsher penalties for convicted criminals, specifically in some instances the death penalty.
Right.
Do you think that harsher penalties are a way to stop crime, and if not, what does?
Yeah, harsher penalties are, contrary to what the Vice President's campaign is telling people. I signed a bill in 1983, Jim, to impose mandatory sentences on drug pushers. And I'm a very tough guy when it comes to crime. I don't happen to support the death penalty, but my state has had the biggest drop in crime of any industrial state in the country in the past 5 years. We have the lowest murder rate of any industrial state in the country, and I've personally led that fight. But I think what is happening in the Bush camp is very clear. The Vice President's record on crime and drugs is pathetic. It's pathetic. Every time he's been given a law enforcement assignment, it's been a failure. The South Florida Task Force was a failure. The federal interdiction effort was a failure. There's nothing George Bush has done of any significance in law enforcement and drugs that he can point to. So what do? Well, you try to divert public attention by suggesting that the other guy is soft on crime. People who know me know that I have been deeply involved in this fight, and I can assure you that I will be deeply involved in it as President of the United States.
Well, you say people who know you, but are you satisfied that you've articulated that position clearly enough to the country? Because polls seem to indicate that people don't know.
Well, one of my jobs, obviously, over the next month is to get that message out and also to point out the cynicism of an effort to use human tragedy in the way that the Bush campaign is doing it. I would also point out to you that I find it a little difficult to understand how somebody can tell the American people that he's tough on crime when he's been part of an administration that traded arms to a terrorist nation and was doing business with Manuel Noriega, a notorious drug trafficker, a suspected murderer. But that's what a political campaign's all about. That's what our debate on Thursday will be all about, and we'll be out in Los Angeles and I'll be looking forward to it.
Governor, legislation is now moving through Congress, which would provide for a death penalty for big-time drug dealers and for those who kill in the act of selling drugs. Would you, as president, permit anyone to be executed for those penalties?
I mean, if the law was...
If the law were to be enacted, sir.
Once you put up your hand, Mike, and you take the oath of office to uphold the Constitution and the laws of this country, then you carry out the laws, whether you agree with them or not. You may go back to the Congress and ask that a law be changed, but if I'm the President of the United States, I'm going to uphold and enforce the law as it is. That's something which, as you know, from time to time hasn't happened over the course of the past few years, but I feel very strongly about that. A president does not have the right to decide which law he will enforce and which law he will not enforce.
Well, let's take it back one step further, if we could. Say that you, as president, received on your desk legislation to that effect. Would you sign it or would you veto it?
No, I'm opposed to the death penalty, and I think people know that. But I'm for very tough drug enforcement, something we have not been getting from this administration. I mean, that's why the Bush claim that he's tough on crime is so absurd, because the record is otherwise. I mean, how can you be serious about enforcing the law when you're doing business with a guy in Panama who's harboring and taking care of the Medellin gang, permits cocaine manufacturing and warehousing on Panamanian soil, and we now know has been deeply involved in drug trafficking for a long time. That's why what's been going on in the Republican campaign on this issue is really so hypocritical. But my job is to go out there and wage a real war, not a phony war against drugs, and I can assure you that's what we'll do, because in my own state we've done it, which is one of the reasons why we've literally put 5 times as many drug pushers behind bars in the past few years as we did in the previous administration.
George Bush and Dan Quayle, both of them are focusing in or pressing the issue on your, as they put it, lack of experience in foreign affairs. And it does appear, I think it's fair to say, that what they are saying is being listened to by the farmers and the steelworkers of the Midwest and by ethnic communities. You know, in Chicago, for example, we have a Polish population that's bigger than any Polish population in any city other than Warsaw.
Right.
And they're always asking questions about how strong you would be in standing up to the regimes from the East. What if, say, Lech Wałęsa was put in jail? Or what if the government in Poland tried to snuff out Solidarity? What would you do as president?
Well, we already saw that happen, Walter, as you know, and there wasn't much that the United States government did do under the circumstances. But I think we should be working always to try to create a climate for human rights and democracy in Eastern Europe. Trying to persuade the Soviet Union that there is no security in the insecurity of Eastern European countries that are constantly in turmoil. As you know, we now have a similar situation in Yugoslavia. And there are other nations in Eastern Europe that may well begin to feel that same drive toward human rights and democracy. So we always have to be encouraging, urging, persuading not only the Soviet Union, but trying to create an environment within which they understand that there is more security in permitting freedom in Eastern Europe than there is in snuffing it out.
May I say respectfully that that's a very statesman-like response to the question, which everybody would like to hear and has heard over and over again. I'd like to get to some brass tacks, if that's possible. Practical positions. I mean, it's not entirely outrageous to assume that the new regime in Poland will throw Wałęsa in jail and just tell Solidarity it's finished. And if you were in the White House, you'd be faced with a pretty tough decision.
But we've gone through that once before, as you know, and I think it was under this administration, if I'm not mistaken. And despite,
now what would you do, though?
Despite President Reagan's strong feelings, and I share them about human rights and democracy in Eastern Europe, there really wasn't much that he did or could do under the circumstances. I think there's a whole new atmosphere out there, Walter. I think what you have in the Soviet Union, finally, is an acknowledgement that their system is a failure, and that they have to liberalize and open up if they're going to succeed and if they're not going to become a third-rate economic power. I had a very good meeting several weeks ago with the new premier of Hungary, a country in the Eastern Bloc, but one that has liberalized. He wants better relationships with the West. He wants to engage in trade and to build a much closer relationship with us in an economic sense. We ought to pursue that. He told me that their goal is 30 or 35% private ownership in Hungary, that they're going to create a new stock market in Hungary, these kinds of things. So that's the direction in which they're moving. I think we ought to encourage that. I think we ought to take up him and others like him when he invites us to develop that kind of relationship, and that's the way, slowly but surely, we can create the kind of climate I'm talking about. I would also pursue negotiations with Gorbachev, obviously, steadily, cautiously, each time making sure that what we do is verifiable and real, but I think there are real opportunities there to encourage the Soviet Union to move in the kind of direction we would like to move, and challenge them to understand that they are not more secure when there are captive nations on their borders. They're much more secure if they permit the kind of freedom to flourish which I think most people in Eastern Europe want.
Governor, let's talk about another troubled region of the world. Politicians, especially presidential candidates, do not like what-if questions, hypothetical questions, but they are important because...
Even governors, Larry.
Well, we really have a right to know.
Sure, yeah.
The Middle East has not been talked about much during this campaign, yet it's an extremely volatile region. It's a hot region. Mm-hmm. If the peace process should fail in the next several years, if there is a peace process in the Middle East, and Israel's very security is threatened, would you commit American ground forces to save it?
Well, we have a strategic relationship with Israel, as you know, which is very important to us. It involves military as well as diplomatic relations. I would prefer to say this, Larry. We have made virtually no progress, as you know, since Camp David, and I think that's unfortunate. We didn't really build on the progress that had been made and the opportunities that were there. I want to resume that effort. I want to make the Middle East one of our top priorities in foreign policy. I think there's a real opportunity now, and it's not going to be easy. This is a troubled, complicated, difficult region. A real opportunity to persuade more Arab leaders than just President Mubarak that Israel ought to have a right to exist within secure borders and peace and dignity, and that the future of the Middle East is far better if there's that kind of peace on a permanent basis and a much more cooperative effort. And that's the kind of thing that I hope we can encourage. But we've always been a nation that has been there when Israel needed us. And while I will be reluctant to answer particular hypothetical questions for obvious reasons, because I don't think any president should forecast in advance when he would or wouldn't use force in a particular situation. Israel can be assured that we will be supportive of them if that were to happen.
I think the question I'm getting at is, would you hesitate to use military force to protect an ally?
I think we have a right to use military force to protect our own national interest, to protect American lives and property, to carry out our treaty responsibilities, and to fight international terrorism.
Governor Dukakis, while we're on the subject of international relations, I think most Americans have a picture of the world that envisions the United States and the Soviet Union competing for power and influence at an upper tier. Western Europe as a collective group, Japan, now the People's Republic of China, at a tier just below that. Look down the road 30 years and tell me what that picture is going to look like then, and what will you do to try to affect it?
Jim, I'm not sure any one of us is wise enough or capable enough to be able to forecast what's likely to happen. I will say this. I think our values, I think human rights, democracy, the opportunity of people everywhere to express themselves, to engage in free political activity, to be creative, I think our values are in the ascendancy these days. I think the totalitarianism and the heavy hand of bureaucracy, which has been a part of the Soviet system, is failing, and people know that. So this is a great opportunity for us to provide international leadership, to take advantage of what I think is probably the best opportunity for meaningful arms control and arms reduction we've had in our lifetimes at the negotiating table with the Soviet Union, to get a comprehensive test ban treaty, to begin negotiations leading to the reduction of conventional forces in Europe with deeper cuts on the Soviet side, and, Larry, to begin now to work to limit or eliminate regional conflict in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Southern Africa, and of course here in our own hemisphere. What would I like to see, Jim? What's my vision of a future? What would I like to do in 8 years as president? I'd like to be the president who provides that kind of international leadership. And Walter, let me say that during this century, 3 of the strongest and best international leaders we've had as president were 3 former governors named Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Theodore Roosevelt. And some of our weakest presidents internationally were people with long experience in Washington. So I don't think it really depends on how long your resume is or how long you've lived in Washington, D.C. I think it's your strength, your values, the quality of the people you pick, and your ability to work with the Congress and they with you, because obviously that's an important part of your success as a president in international relations.
If our values are in ascendancy, what about our economic clout, and what does that mean?
That's my concern. That's my concern. I want this country to be number one, not number 2, number 5, and number 7. And we are facing a period of real economic uncertainty. Yeah, it looks pretty good at home. But remember those $200 billion worth of hot checks. Remember the $1.5 trillion of additional national debt that has been put on the backs of the American taxpayers over the course of the past 8 years. We've got to get out there and we've got to compete with the best of them. We cannot be satisfied with the status quo. This country did not become the greatest nation on the face of the earth because we were satisfied with where we were. We're always moving forward, trying to do better. And particularly now, as you look, Jim, at 1992, Europe will become a single economic entity for the first time in history with over 300 million people. When you look at what's happening in the Pacific Rim, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, you know we're in a fight for our economic future. And one of the things that has been so unfortunate about our inability to balance our budgets and this running up of this massive debt is that, as you know, much of it is being provided to us by foreign bankers. And as anyone knows who becomes the biggest borrowing nation in the world, having been the biggest lending nation 8 years ago, that's a very, very dangerous situation for us. That begins to raise questions about whether or not we can control our own economic destiny. And that's one of the reasons, I believe, why Mike Dukakas and Lloyd Bentsen should be elected, because I think we have the ability to do that, and we will do it.
Governor, the National Economics Commission, which is a bipartisan group headed by Drew Lewis and Bob Strauss, Republican and Democrat, and comprised of a great many business leaders, has now come out and is starting to talk openly about not only the possibility, but the need for higher taxes in addition to more spending cuts. I know the T word is a dirty word this campaign, but is there any way you can envision avoiding raising taxes?
Yes, I think it's possible, Mike, although I've said, and you've heard me say many, many times, that no serious candidate for the presidency can rule them out, and Mr. Bush's no tax pledge isn't worth the paper it's printed on. He's already broken it 3 times. But before we impose new taxes on the vast majority of Americans who are paying their taxes and pay them on time, I think we've got to do a number of things. First, we've got to make some tough choices on spending. Now, I've done that, as you know. I've been criticized by Mr. Bush. He wants to spend billions on Star Wars and MX missiles and railroad cars and supercarrier task forces and these kinds of things. There's no way you can do all of that and at the same time be serious about bringing down the deficit. I've also proposed some cuts on the domestic side, as you know. We've got to get the rate of economic growth up in this country and keep it there. That's the best and the easiest way to have revenue flowing into the Treasury. If we can get a president who can work with the Congress, and I don't believe Mr. Bush can work with the Congress, then we can begin to bring that deficit down. That can bring interest rates down. Finally, we aren't collecting over $100 billion in taxes owed that aren't being paid in this country every year. And it seems to me that that's where you go first. Now, I and a number of other governors have had great success at revenue enforcement. And I mean fairly and in a way which encourages voluntary compliance as well, providing taxpayer assistance, getting those refunds back on time, as well as being tough on those who aren't paying their taxes. So that's where I begin, and I think it's possible with a combination of those things to avoid new taxes. But no serious candidate for the presidency can look you in the eye and say at no time in the next 8 years will I ask the Congress for new revenue. This administration has raised taxes 5 times in the past 7 years, so the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
You wouldn't say impossible, but would you say probable or likely?
No, I think,
or where?
I would begin with a kind of deficit reduction plan that I've laid out for you. It's the kind of thing that has made it possible for me to balance 10 budgets in a row. I did have to raise taxes my first year in office in 1975, and that was after I inherited the biggest state deficit proportionally in the country. But we've cut taxes now 5 times in the past 6 years, and our revenue and tax burden in Massachusetts is well below the national average. So I would begin with those 4 steps. And I think it's possible with good, strong cooperation with Congress to do it. Recall, however, that in our debate the other day, it was Mr. Bush who said, well, it's not our fault, it's the Congress's fault. I'll tell you, if you go to the White House with that attitude, you can't succeed.
Well, how about committing to a ceiling here somehow? You know, we now have a maximum tax rate of 28%. And the world out there believes, based on what George Bush and Dan Quayle have been telling everybody, is that you'll bring it up to 35–40%. Do you want to put a ceiling
Well, I
on
don't
it?
think the world believes that, Walter. I mean, they know my record. They know the fact that I really have balanced budgets, something that Mr. Bush, Mr. Quayle never have done. They know that I've cut taxes while the administration has been raising them now steadily over the course. Matter of fact, the President just this year signed 2 bills which will increase taxes. And they also know that I've had one of the most successful records in the country as a governor in collecting taxes that aren't being paid, mostly by the wealthy and folks that are avoiding their taxes. So that's where I'd begin.
Is it time for one or other of the 2 candidates to be specific on a commitment to keep taxes down? You've said that you will raise them only in austere...
They always should be a last resort. I mean, I don't think taxes ought to be a first resort.
Well, what's a last resort?
After you've taken the steps that I've outlined, which I think in combination can probably avoid the imposition of new taxes. But when George Bush tells you that he won't raise taxes, you know, read my lips, he's got to be kidding the American people. He made the commitment. He broke it a month later. He has supported both of the bills that I've talked about, which raised taxes this year. So that pledge isn't worth a thing. What I've laid out for you is a plan which is based not only on my own experience as governor, but on the experience of a great many people. I think it will work, but one never really can be sure until one gets in and goes to work. I think we can do it. I think we can do it with a strong partnership with the Congress.
Governor, the Philadelphia Navy Yard is vital to the economies of both eastern Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey. Thousands of jobs there.
Right.
Would you continue the Reagan administration policy of retooling old Navy vessels, restructuring them and renovating them, and keep all those jobs in the Philadelphia area?
I sure would, but if memory serves me right, Larry, wasn't it the Reagan administration that was talking about closing it down? Wasn't it Congressman Folletta and others who managed to keep it open when the administration wanted to close it down?
That is correct, but would you continue that policy?
And wasn't it Senator Quayle who went to Philadelphia recently and told them that I was going to close it down? I mean, how hypocritical can you get?
Would you keep it open?
Sure, because I'm a very strong believer in investing in conventional forces, as you know. And the retooling and the rebuilding and the refitting that takes place at the Philadelphia Naval Yard is precisely the kind of thing that we're going to do if we want a good, strong, conventional fighting force. If you have an administration that wants to spend those billions on Star Wars and MXs on railroad cars and 3-hour space planes from Washington to Tokyo, then strong conventional forces are threatened, and then I think the Philadelphia Naval Yard is in trouble. But remember, it was this administration that tried to close that yard, and we're not going to close it. That's an important facility. It's going to stay open.
Governor, let me take you to another somewhat localized concern. Senator Benson spoke rather eloquently last week, I think, about the problems of Mexico, our neighbor to the south. I live in Southern California. In California, an overwhelming preponderance of our agricultural workers are undocumented aliens. In the not too far distant future, the situation may exist where Caucasian and black students make up less than half of the elementary school children in California. What is your immigration policy?
Well, we have a law on the books, as you know, Jim, and again, as I said to Mike, when you raise your hand on the 20th of January and you take that oath, you swear to uphold the law, and I would do so. I think the administration of the law can be improved. I don't think we have to divide families, and there's plenty of discretion on the part of the administrator of the Immigration Naturalization Service to stop that kind of thing. There is additional legislation going through the Congress, as you know, which would liberalize our immigration laws, provide for additional immigration, and for the reunification of families and others.
You'd support that legislation?
There are certain aspects of the Senate bill which I would like to see changed, but I think it's important that we strengthen and expand that as well. The real problem, as you know, is Mexico and its economic situation. And that's something that I take very seriously, so does Senator Benson. We're going to build a whole new relationship with Mexico and with our Central and Latin America Democratic allies. The Republicans just don't understand what's really happening, I think. This continuation of this failed policy in Nicaragua, the turmoil in Central America generally. We have the best group of democratically elected chiefs of state in Central and Latin America we've had in our lifetimes. They want to work with us. They want to create this new association. There is a new, young, able president of Mexico who wants to work with us. But this is a time for a new administration in Washington that understands how you build that new relationship based on mutual trust and respect. We will have a hemispheric summit just as soon after the 20th of January as possible. Our relationship, obviously, with Mexico will be very important with President Salinas, and it's something that both I and Senator Benson care very deeply about.
Governor, on the subject of families, we now see in Washington the move is underway to change welfare into workfare. Do you think it's right and proper that government should require welfare recipients to either go to work or go to job training programs?
Well, we do that now, Mike. If somebody on welfare has children of school age, they're required to register for work. But what's most important, and I think really very gratifying, is that finally we have a welfare reform bill, which, as you may know, was proposed by the 50 governors on a bipartisan basis, opposed by the administration. But fortunately, thanks to the work of the Congress, we got a good bill, and the President either has signed it or is about to sign it. I'm proud to say it's based on work done in Massachusetts, on progress that we made in helping now over 50,000 welfare families to move from welfare to work over the past 5 years. How? By providing real training for real jobs for those welfare mothers, daycare for those children, and it's worked. And I can tell you of literally hundreds and hundreds of stories of women who have been on welfare for 5, 10, 15 years who today are surgical technicians and teaching hospitals, and working for high-tech firms, and making it on their own and supporting themselves and their children, making sure their children are going to school. It works. I've seen it. It's happened in my own state. I want to be a president who makes that happen in every state in the country. We could help literally millions of families to get off of welfare and, Walter, cut the deficit at the same time. And that's the great thing about an effective welfare reform plan. You can help people to lift themselves out of poverty and save money at the same time.
But, Governor, you've seen the welfare hotels here in New York City, and I assume that all of our cities are plagued by the underclass that has developed and emerged. Is this plan going to do away with the underclass? Are we suddenly going to see this as a panacea?
Depends on who the president is. Depends on whether he has a commitment to this. Depends on whether he knows how to do it. And I can tell you, based on my experience as governor of my state, that it works, that the vast majority of people on welfare really want to get off of welfare if they're provided with real training for real jobs and some daycare for their children so they can go into that training program. I'll tell you, it is one of the most satisfying things that I've ever done in public life. And when I think of people like Ruby Sampson and Dawn Lawson, young mothers on welfare, in Ruby Sampson's case, a woman who had been on welfare for 14 years. Ruby Sampson today is a surgical technician at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, one of the finest teaching hospitals in the world. Dawn Lawson is an executive secretary for the Norton Company, making about $20,000 a year and supporting herself and her son. And they're just two examples of many of people on welfare who've made it. So I'm very anxious to be elected and to go to work and to make that happen all over the country. And remember, you have 50 governors who worked very hard to produce that bill, are strongly committed to it, and at the same time, we can save money for welfare and Medicaid by helping people to get off of welfare.
I have a family question, and excuse me for being parochial, but the former Secretary of Education, Jim Bennett, said that Chicago has the worst school system in the entire country. I'm sure you heard him say that. And the fact is that people, and I'm sure it's not only Chicago, but other major cities, young families are fleeing the cities because they're afraid of the educational system, and they're going to the suburbs where they think they can get a better education. Now, both you and Bush, of course, have expressed commitment to the solving of the educational problems. But
my commitment goes back a long way, Walter. Mr. Bush's is a recent election year conversion. I don't recall his ever having expressed concern as important educational programs were cut and slashed for inner city kids and city schools. But my record is clear.
Well, if you do become president, what could families expect to get in the way of educational help for their children that families cannot expect to get if George Bush becomes president?
A strong commitment based on a record of accomplishment in working with schools in our urban communities, in working with business communities in our urban communities, that I'm going to ask and urge to become a part of this, because they have a stake in all of this as well, with mayors, with local school boards. There is much we can do.
You mean get a commitment from the private sector to support the public schools?
Not only that, but do what is happening not only in my own capital city, but now increasingly in cities all over the country, where the business community is actively and deeply involved in adopting schools and providing college scholarships for young people who graduate from high school, and working directly with youngsters in middle schools and junior high schools as well as high schools to identify those kids who may be risking dropout, by getting into that problem early and working with urban school systems all over the country.
And you'll do all that and reduce the deficit as well?
We can provide some additional help financially, Walter, though remember it's states and local communities that bear principal responsibility for this. But there are some very exciting, very creative, very innovative things that are taking place in cities all over the country. And I think one of the things that a president and a secretary of education who works in partnership with people can do is to bring those ideas to cities, to encourage them, to provide, yes, some financial support. But again, remember, that's going to require some tough choices. Do we want star wars or star schools in this country? I mean, those are the kinds of choices that a president has to make. I'm prepared to make them. George Bush is not.
Governor, I want to ask you a personal question. I think that people who go into the voting booth want to know a little bit about the person, how they react to success and failure. What did you learn from the mistakes when you were defeated for governor back in the late 70s? What did you learn from that experience?
Larry, it was probably the most important and in some ways the most valuable experience of my life, even though it was very painful when it happened, as you could imagine, because I had just gone through a very hard 4 years. I thought we had made some real progress. I was 40 or 50 percentage points ahead in the polls, lost, which is one of the reasons why I don't pay much attention to polls, no matter what they say. But sometimes defeat is an important experience. I guess it always is. And I'm a much better person as a result of that. I think I'm a lot calmer. Some people say, Walter, I'm almost too cool, but I think that's what happens when you go through an experience like that. I'm a much better listener. I'm a much better consensus builder. I can bring people together and make things happen today in a way that I couldn't before that defeat. I think I'm more sensitive to others. You know, when you go through an experience like that, I think you're much more sensitive to the concerns of others and the hurt that sometimes they go through. And
do you have less of a fear of losing this time around in terms of
I think once you've gone through an experience like that, you know, I was a fellow that had always been an achiever in school and had done well in politics. And in that sense, too, what do they say? No pain, no gain without pain. Well, sometimes one has to experience a certain amount of pain to be a better person. And I am, and there's no question in my mind that if I'm elected President of the United States, I will be a much better president for having gone through that experience. I just assume not repeat it again, needless to say. And I hope with the help of good people all across this country, Lloyd Bentsen and I will be successful. But it was an important personal experience for me.
Governor, you've given yourself some credit, and Senator Bentsen has given you credit for the line of thinking that led you to choose a vice presidential nominee whose positions on some issues are diametrically opposed to your own. Would we see that line of thinking repeated in the assemblage of a cabinet and a White House staff? Or are those people going to be people who think like Mike Dukakis?
Jim, I've been a chief executive now, as I said, for 10 years, and I've picked cabinets, I've appointed judges, all things that George Bush has never done. If you talk to people who've watched me in action, I pick strong people. That's why I picked Lloyd Bentsen. And take a look at the way I made that decision and the way Mr. Bush made his decision. I want a strong vice president. I want a vice president who's going to walk into the Oval Office if somebody comes up with a crazy idea like trading arms with the Ayatollah for hostages and say, Mr. President, this is wrong. This is crazy. We can't do this. Now, he himself has said, and rightly so, that once the president makes a decision, that's going to be the administration's decision. But you will see me with a cabinet and a vice president that are strong, that are mature, that are experienced, and that are prepared to challenge me. If you look at the way Mr. Bush went about the selection of a vice president, I don't think you can say the same thing.
There's a public perception that the politics of Boston are relatively insular, and I think there are some people who fear the idea of a Boston mob or a Harvard mafia in the cabinet.
Yeah. You'll see a cabinet that's diverse, that comes from all parts of the country. There will be people from the West and the South and the Midwest as well as the Northeast. It'll be a very diverse cabinet, a very strong cabinet. And that's the way it's going to be. You know, we did have another president from Boston who did pretty well before he was tragically killed, and I think most people agree that John Kennedy had that same kind of cabinet, and it was a good one. But my cabinets are strong. They're good, experienced, seasoned people, and again, the reason I picked Lloyd Bentsen was because we agree on most things, Jim, but we have some disagreements, and I think it was in the debate that I quoted Sam Rayburn, the late great Speaker of the House from Texas, is saying that if two people agree on everything, then only one of them is doing the thinking. So I think that's probably a good principle to follow when it comes to picking people.
Governor, a little earlier you mentioned the importance of dealing with the Soviets and of negotiating with Gorbachev and the possibility of new attitudes emerging over there. Several years ago at the Reykjavik summit, suddenly we heard about the zero option.
Right.
And for a while there it looked like perhaps we were seriously considering moves to totally ban nuclear weapons. Right. If you had been at Reykjavik, would you have gone for the zero option?
No, it was not a good step. It raised all kinds of havoc, Mike, with our allies as well as with the Congress. Had never heard of it. Had never been able to consider it and opposed it. We've got to begin with the START negotiations. Let's get a 50% cut in strategic weapons. Let's begin to seriously negotiate reductions in conventional forces in Europe with deeper cuts on the Soviet side, which Gorbachev says he's for. Let's take it step by step, gradually, with confidence-building measures. That's why the INF Treaty was so important. That's why I supported the INF Treaty so strongly. But let's get going on START negotiations, build on what's been done already. There's no reason to throw out the progress that's already been made. Let's build on that. Let's get a comprehensive test ban treaty. Let's begin those negotiations on conventional forces in Europe. I think that's the way to do it. But in all of these cases, a president must keep the Congress informed and he must keep our allies informed. You can't spring those kinds of surprises and build the kind of confidence with the Congress and our allies that we need.
Take it down the road a way. We've gone through several rounds of negotiations. Is the goal eventually the elimination of nuclear weapons? Can this country ever be safe without a nuclear deterrence?
Well, at least for the foreseeable future, I think we're going to need and must have an effective, credible, strong nuclear deterrent. But obviously it's in our interest, in the Soviet Union's interest, and in the world's interest to bring the level of those arms down, to bring the level of conventional forces down in Europe if we can in a satisfactory way, and at the same time to collaborate, if at all possible, Larry, in limiting or eliminating regional conflicts in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Southern Africa, in Central America. I think those should be our goals, and if we all meet again in 8 years and do this again, and I've been president for 8 years, I'd like to be able to say to you that we've made great progress in doing so.
Governor, we're fast running out of our hour. It's been interesting. It's too bad we can't ask a little bit more about your personal life, which one day we all should know more about.
Well, lots of people have been asking about that too, Walt.
It's good to see him smile, right? Have you thought about any cabinet members to affect the policy you're just talking about? No names come to mind yet?
My one important
Secretary of State
selection was Vice President, and I'm very proud of my selection. I think the American people have had a chance to see Lloyd Bentsen in action, and I think they...
But if you're planning on winning, how could you be this long in the process and not have given some serious consideration
well, I have
to the kind of person who might be your Secretary of Defense?
Well, I have a transition team which is already in being and is active and is doing the kinds of things that you would expect a transition team to do before the actual election. But I can say this to you. I will have a Secretary of State, a Secretary of Defense, and other cabinet secretaries who are seasoned, experienced people who've had experience in the public sector, who, like Lloyd Bentsen, are proven leaders. I will not be picking second or third stringers here. These are going to be first-string people who know what they're doing, who will challenge me, and who particularly in the area of foreign policy and defense will be experienced, thoughtful, able, mature people.
Governor Dukakis, thank you very much, and on behalf of our panel from across the country, it's been enjoyable spending this time with you.
It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you in your respective cities from time to time.
Thank you, sir.
Our thanks to Governor Dukakis and to my colleagues from New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago.